Welcome to the Ardent Archives, a ministry of North Clay Baptist Church. Here we explore the writings of church history in order to edify and equip the saints in their ongoing discipleship. In this series, we are reading and discussing Christianity and Liberalism by J. Gresham Machen. Written at the beginning of the 20th century, Machen's classic work remains as relevant today as it was when it was written. Machen sought to expose liberalism's foundation as contrary to that of orthodox, biblical Christianity. In his own words, Machen saw the issue in the church of the present day as being not between two varieties of the same religion, but at bottom, between two essentially different types of thought and life. So prepare yourself as we dive into the antithesis of Christianity and liberalism by J. Gresham Machen. Hello again and welcome back to the Ardent Archives. The Ardent Archives is a podcast ministry of North Clay Baptist Church where we are reading and discussing books from church history. I am one of your hosts. My name is Pastor Drew Bieber and I'm here with my co-host, Pastor Josh McDaniel. Josh, how are you this morning?
Doing very well. Excited to kind of talk about Machen and the book that we've just read.
Me as well. Before we jump into that, let me address a couple of things. So I routinely, after we record these things, I go back and I listen to the podcast. I do listen to the recordings, not because I like the sound of my own voice, but because I am extremely critical of myself in particular.
Right.
And so because I also like to be somewhat self-deprecating and talk about how terrible I sound and how weird I sound and all that sort of stuff.
Nothing feels better than to break our own selves down.
Exactly. And so all that to say, in listening back to the podcast, I have discovered that at times I say things incorrectly.
Okay.
And I get facts incorrect as well.
Okay.
For instance, when we were discussing assurance, I mentioned that Calvin wanted his theology to be understood through the lens, primarily through the lens of his preaching. And I had that backwards. He wanted his preaching to be primarily understood through the lens of the Institutes.
Okay. I didn't catch it.
I didn't catch it either. And I think I just remembered it wrong, and that's why I said it wrong. But I'm saying this now because I want to be upfront. You know, if I make mistakes, I want to acknowledge those mistakes. And I also just want to make clear that I'm going to make mistakes. And it's part of just being,
hey, you and me
a member
both.
of fallen humanity.
That's right. That's right. You and me both, Drew. I shudder sometimes to think about the things I've said when teaching or when, walking through lessons and stuff like that. I look back and think, oh, man, did I really just say that?
Right.
And I have to go back. Not anything necessarily heretical or, condemning, but just, I had that whole quote botched, or something like that,
Well, and I was listening to someone else. I was listening to, I think it was James White, and he was making that point. Calvin wanted his theology to be understood through the Institutes, and I went, I have that totally backwards. And I totally said the 100% incorrect thing on this issue. And so, at any rate, I just wanted to acknowledge the mistakes and, just make sure everyone understands that it's bound to happen. It is what it is.
And if James White is listening, thanks, James.
Yeah, I do appreciate the correction there. I doubt he listens to this. I don't think he's got time for that kind of thing.
Ain't nobody got time for that.
No. But at any rate, I am very excited to discuss this book. I read this book for the first time, I guess it's about 5 or 6 years ago.
Okay.
At the time, I was working at a financial institution. I was working at a local credit union. And, there was always time in between, dealing with, members and different things like that. And so to kill the time, I would pull up a phone on my book, pull up a book on my phone and, would pass the time by reading through different books. And this was one of them that I had heard about. I knew who Machen was loosely. And so I decided to go ahead and read this book. And it had, just a tremendous impact on my understanding of what is foundational and what is fundamental to the Christian faith. Yeah.
So this was the first time I had read this book. I had heard about it and it was kind of one of those that I had on my list to read.
Yeah.
But I had never actually pulled it off the shelf, started reading through it until you said, hey, I think this would be the next one we should work through. And so then, kind of pulled it off and looked at it, and so glad that we took the time to read this one. And it's
absolutely.
Even though it was written in 1923, man, it is still so timely for our generation and our times today.
Yeah. And I think, I think truth is timeless. And so anytime you are presenting truth, I think that it always stands the test of time. It never goes, out of style, so to say.
Right.
Even though I guess you could make the argument that today truth is somewhat out of style. Nobody cares about truth. Nobody wants to know the truth. But Jesus is the one who said, I am the way and the truth.
Yeah.
And we live in God's world, so it's kind of an inescapable concept in that sense. We'll never be able to outrun or escape or bury the truth. That's just the nature of living in God's world.
Right. And the thing is they just changed terms. When Jesus spoke truth, he was called narrow, and he was called,
blasphemer.
When we speak truth, we're called bigots. You know what I mean? So we just changed terms. That's all. But I mean, truth has never been popular with the world, and truth has always had a way of cutting to the heart of people and saying things they don't like to hear all the time, but it has always stood the test of time. It's never gotten outdated.
Right. And speaking of that, I was listening to another podcast, and he made the comment, in the movie Jurassic Park, the saying is life will find a way. Mm-hmm. And he was saying, I think that's true of truth. Truth always finds a way.
Right.
And I think, we see that on display in this work in particular. And so before we actually get into the book, obviously in these introductions, we want to talk about the author, kind of talk about some of the events leading up to writing the book. But for this discussion as well, we're also going to cover the introduction of the book, because we actually read through and, the actual introduction of the book, because, we can talk about why Machen wrote the book, but why not let Machen speak for himself as to why he wrote the book? And so that's one of the main reasons we wanted to do that. And so we do want to cover kind of who he was, kind of what his background is, but then also cover the introduction of the book as well. And so Machen was one of three sons born to Arthur Webster Machen and Mary Jones Gresham. He was born in 1881 in Maryland. So,
well, so he had ties here in America, which is really interesting too. Right. The guys that we've read thus far, they weren't Americans.
No, none of them were.
And so this was an interesting thing to, this guy, he was there, with a lot of things that, we learn about in history and in our schools and everything, like from the American history, from our own background as Americans.
Right.
He was there in the middle of it. His brother even fought in the Civil War, kind of stuff like that, where we kind of think, wow, it feels just more home based in some ways.
Right. And I mean, and he, some of the main events of his life were, within the last century, which for us seems like a long time ago, but in the span of human history, 100 years is nothing. Like this is recent. These are recent events. Machen is in all senses of the word, he's a modern individual. He's a modern, character.
I mean, maybe not for everyone listening to this, podcast, Drew, but at least for you and I, he died in the same century we were born in.
Right.
I mean, which is, that's. I know that for some people listening, that might be like completely far gone, but for us, we're still there in it.
In some senses, though, we think of like, oh, he was born in the 1800s. That could have been 1801, or that could have been 1890.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so we think, oh, well, Josh McDaniel and Drew Bieber lived in the same century as J. Gresham Machen. It's like, yeah, but they were separated by a couple hundred,
There's a bit of time.
several
There's a
decades.
A little bit of a gap there, just a smidgen.
Yeah.
But in that way, we can see, because we grew up and we are still growing up in the country that he made his fight in the times that he made his fight in, and kind of the history of it. We grow up realizing and seeing the fruit of some of the things that he laid down, and we're still seeing that today. And
we're still seeing that fight played out today.
We're still seeing the fight, and we're still seeing that, hey, it's still the same charge that he was making in this book.
Right.
It's this is where the liberal ideas stray from the Christian ideas. And he makes no bones about it. He pulls no punches. He calls it liberalism and Christianity. Liberalism had no place in Christianity in his own wording in this book and in every kind of debate that he undertook.
Yeah. So he was raised in a Christian home, and he was catechized primarily by his mother. His mother was a lifelong Presbyterian, and so he was raised learning the Westminster Confession of Faith and the Westminster Shorter Catechism. And when he graduated high school, I guess if you could call it graduating high school, I think it was a little bit different back in those days. But at the age of 17, he went on to study at Johns Hopkins, where he got his undergraduate degree in the classics. And when he graduated, his father was a lawyer, and when he graduated, he was kind of somewhat torn between sort of the path he wanted to take on his life. He had considered studying law. He had considered studying medicine as well. And what was also on the table was studying theology. And eventually that's what he settled on. And he chose to study theology at Princeton Seminary, which, today we would not see as sort of a bastion of Christian
no, not at all.
Intellectual thought. But at the time, Princeton Seminary was one of the foremost Christian seminaries really in the world. And there's people often refer to the great Princeton theologians, of which Machen is largely considered the last of the great Princeton theologians. And he actually, while he was, when he decided to go and study theology there, he also was seeking a dual master in philosophy from Princeton University at the same time.
Which came in very handy.
Oh, absolutely.
Very, very handy. It's interesting, though, you said he was considering going into law or theology was on the table, but it's always interesting when you see some of these guys who make the biggest splash, they look at their life and they recognize, I've got options. Right, I've got avenues and areas that I could go, and they make themselves, or they poise themselves to make an impact in all of these potential areas, but then because of the Lord's work in their life, or because of even the Lord's work through the culture in their life, they settle in on, I want to be and do good for the church and for the Christian faith. And man, these guys sometimes they make the biggest impact because they recognize I could be these things in the world, but God has given me these talents uniquely to serve the church. And that was Machen, man. Well,
and it's so different from our modern age where people aren't content to work in the areas that God has given them. Mm-hmm. Instead, we are very, what's the right way to describe it? Like very movement oriented.
Yeah,
everybody wants to make an impact.
Yes.
And so we start looking for ways to make an impact rather than focusing on, diligence and faithfulness where God has placed us.
Everybody wants to be infamous.
Yes.
Everybody wants to be that. They don't consider that, hey, you know what? Being the guy who has served the church and have been at a church for 50 years is just as impactful and more impactful than 15 minutes of fame. Over here being on, whatever it is, YouTube or, whatever.
Well, and, you see this sort of in microcosm with all of these social media platforms where, comedy, for instance, people will write comedy for the social media algorithms. They're not actually trying to be funny. They're trying to get likes. They're trying to get plays. They're trying to get views or whatever the particular mechanism is for that platform. And so they're writing intentionally to sort of trick the algorithm into pushing their content further.
Right.
And it's just unfortunate because I'm like, nobody cares about what's actually funny anymore. It's what gets the most views. It's what gets the most likes. And and sometimes that's the way we approach our life is we think, how can I trick, this life algorithm into, success and fame and fortune and all this sorts of thing, instead of, let me just look at where God has placed me and let me just be the best there.
Yeah.
I think, it'd be safe to say that Machen wasn't trying to do what he did, but as a natural outworking of what God was doing in his life, this inevitably happened.
Right, because he was called to fight a fight.
Right.
And so since he was called to fight a fight, he took up arms, and he did it with every bit of fervor that he had. And because of his fervor, because of his eloquence, because of all these kinds of things that God gifted him with, we are talking about him today.
Right.
And we are talking about his book, but that was never the goal. He was never looking for the quote unquote likes or the quote unquote views of the day.
Right. He wasn't trying to go viral.
Yeah.
In modern parlance.
What he was trying to do is he was trying to take up the call that God had given to him and what he had put in his lap. And so often we view ministry as much more about how many eyes can be on us rather than how can we take this gospel and how can we be used by God to be involved in the lives of those that God brings to us.
Right. And so he, in 1905, he spent a year during his theological studies. He spent a year in Germany, and there he studied under a Wilhelm Hermann, who was a Lutheran German theologian. And this Professor Hermann was also taught some other famous characters such as Rudolf Bultmann and Karl Barth. Mm-hmm. And his theology was largely influenced by Immanuel Kant.
Yeah.
And during Machen's time studying under him, because he took a very sort of liberal perspective on the Christian faith, Machen actually admitted that he struggled with his faith while he was in Germany. And most of what we know about Machen, he, more than anything else, he wrote letters to his mother.
Yeah.
And he also wrote letters to his father, but him and his mother had a special relationship where they were constantly writing back and forth. And that's a lot of where we understand sort of Machen and where he was and sort of his development and his theology and as a person. We can glean from his letters to his parents. And we actually found this out through a letter that he wrote to his father, where he said, I'm somewhat confused about my faith because of the things that I'm learning here in Germany under this liberal professor. And yet it was through that experience that he became very resolved and very sure of his faith, particularly that which is taught in the Reformed traditions. Mm-hmm. And so it was, although it was a difficult experience because he struggled with his faith, this is what actually strengthened his faith, and he became very convinced and very strong in what he understood as the true biblical teaching.
And we see that played out over and over and over again in Christianity in particular, where struggle or where testing or trials, those things produce in Christians a fervor or a passion for the true and right gospel that is unyielding.
Right.
And so it worked its way out in Machen, and because of that, he became such a staunch fighter for the true gospel. And I think back to the Pilgrim's Progress, where you have in the interpreter's house, and you have Satan who's casting his liquid upon the flame, and you think that the flame should be burnt out, and everything like that. But then Christian is taken to the other side, where he sees what's actually happening is the water in the bucket that's being poured on the fire is being replaced by the Spirit, and it is through the water or the bucket is representing persecution, and the flame is representing the church. And so the devil thinks he's throwing something that should be putting out the church.
Right, but the fire grows hotter and hotter because of the Spirit's work. Because
the Spirit is changing that water in the bucket to an oil or into a kind of a kerosene or an inflammatory liquid.
Right.
And so every time Machen, he meets it head on, and instead of him crumbling underneath the pressure of it, man, it almost ignites him even hotter for the gospel.
Right, absolutely.
And so by the time he comes back to the States in 1906 to start teaching at Princeton, and he starts seeing that same garbage being espoused there, man, he's ready to fight.
Oh, absolutely.
He's no longer being taught by a professor. He is now the professor.
Yeah.
And so as the professor, let me take up arms against this.
Right. And he, very quickly after, coming home from Germany, he settled at Princeton, and he was continued his work as a New Testament scholar there. And he quickly gained a reputation for being a true intellectual and being able to engage the Christian faith on an intellectual level. And more than anyone else, really, he was able to combat these liberal ideas, not just on the theological level, but also on the intellectual level, which like you mentioned, I think his study in philosophy, definitely
that was a huge contributor
in that front.
Absolutely, it was. And that kind of guys like that in particular today, when you have intellectuals rise up for Christianity, they just get mocked and they get mocked and they get mocked and mocked. Back then, if you had an intellectual who could compete, there seemed to be, I guess, at least on some level, there was a bit of respect. Hey, there's an intellectual over here, and we've got an intellectual over here, and they might have differing views, but they have a respect for each other in that, we're going to legit see which debate,
Right.
I guess the side of, or I guess the evidence leans towards in this debate.
Right.
Today, it's a little bit more. True intellectualism isn't as prominent today.
No, not at all.
But back then, because he was an intellectual, man, that made a huge difference.
Yes,
he wasn't just
absolutely.
getting up there and on the street level just arguing. No. He was arguing from the intellectual academic prowess of Princeton.
Right.
And man, that was a big deal.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I do just want to hit just a couple of highlights from his time at Princeton. In 1921, he wrote probably his most famous book, which is The Origin of Paul's Religion.
Yeah.
And, one of the things he started to notice is that there was this idea that Paul's theology was somewhat different from Jesus's theology. We hear that today, I don't like that Calvinism because, it relies too heavily on Paul. I'm more interested in what Jesus said. Mm-hmm. And, that sort of understanding comes from a faulty understanding of the nature of Scripture. But you also are mistaken. Paul and Jesus are completely aligned in what they taught.
That's right.
But the main push of this book was to sort of combat the idea and to critique those who were saying that Paul's theology was derived primarily from Greek mythology and philosophy. That's really where Paul was coming from, is he was a Greek philosopher more than he was a Jesus follower or something like that. But that was probably his most popular work. And then, like we've already mentioned, in 1923 he wrote Christianity and Liberalism, and we'll kind of circle back to that when we talk about the introduction to the book. In 1925 he wrote a book called What is Faith? And in that book his primary goal was to really anchor the Christian faith in not just the person and work of Jesus Christ, in general, but specifically the historical truth of the atonement of Christ. Yeah. He was, some people, and I've heard this today as well, some people like to say, well, it doesn't matter if it actually happened,
right.
Whether or not it actually happened is kind of irrelevant, is what he taught, is what Jesus taught good, is what he did good.
Yeah.
And, and Machen kind of hits on this in the book
that we just read.
Yeah, where he talks about, Jesus was not just our example of faith, but he was the actual object of faith. And if what he did didn't actually happen, well, then our faith is, as the Apostle Paul says, we're the most to be pitied.
That's right.
If it didn't happen.
That's right.
And then in 1929, this is when he actually left Princeton. At the time, Princeton still is under the auspices of the Presbyterian Church USA, the PCUSA, not to be confused with the PCA, which is, a separate sort of denomination.
Yeah.
But at the time, it was referred to as the Northern Presbyterian Church and later became the PCUSA.
Right.
And they reorganized Princeton Seminary, and they appointed two signatories from what was known as the Auburn Affirmation. And they signed these two signatories to the Board of Trustees. And what this Auburn Affirmation is it was the culmination of really the controversy between the modernists and the fundamentalists.
Yeah.
And really, they were, more than anything else, they were trying to denounce the procedure affirming the fundamentalists in the General Assembly of the Northern Presbyterian Church.
Yeah. In other words, they were siding with exactly what Machen had been saying needed to be condemned or needed to be distanced from. Princeton decided we were going to side with it.
Well, not just Princeton in particular,
but
Princeton
the
Seminary,
PCUSA,
but the PCUSA in general. This Auburn Affirmation was really was a liberal position.
Yeah.
And it was a response to a controversy that arose out of Harry Emerson Fosdick's sermon, "Shall the Fundamentalists Win?" Mm-hmm. And so that they sort of came up with this statement saying, we reject this fundamentalist ideology. I'm probably butchering the description of that. But
they drew a line in the sand.
Right. These Auburn Affirmation signatories, like you said, they drew a line in the sand and they said, we're sort of rejecting some of this fundamentalist teaching. And when Princeton decided to allow some of these signatories on the Board of Trustees, they were essentially making a public statement that we have no problem with these liberals. And I mean, as we saw in the book, Machen saw liberalism not as, sort of a, competing Christian idea. He saw it as a completely separate religion. And
when he sees this line in the sand, I mean, that's exactly what there's a line in the sand. Are you going to cross it? And so he has a decision to make, but it's really not a decision at all to make because of the stance that he's taken so firmly in this book.
Right.
As well in all of his teaching. I mean, there's are you going to come on this side of the line, and are you going to play nice with all these liberal theologians and all these guys who are having a different gospel, which is no gospel at all? Are you going to come over here with us and play nice with us, or are you going to continue to take your stand? Right. For Machen in 1929, I mean, it's a choice, but it's not really a choice.
Right. I mean, and he makes that clear in the last chapter of the book where, he's kind of going back and forth on this idea. Okay, so if the church is capitulating to these liberal ideologies, who should really be the one to step out? Mm-hmm. And he makes the point, it makes the most sense for the liberals to step out because they're the ones standing opposed to the historic tenets of that denomination, of the constitutions of that denomination, the confessions. But he also makes the case that there could be a time and a place for the Orthodox, for the conservatives to step out if they continue in a certain direction. And that's exactly what he did.
Yeah.
And when he stepped out, he actually formed Westminster Theological Seminary, which, in my opinion, is one of the more foremost theological seminaries, in the United States today, but particularly Reformed.
Yeah.
That come from the Reformed perspective.
Yeah. Well, and it's because they made it's called Westminster, so obviously the Westminster Confession. They made the Bible that was their standard.
Right.
That hey, we've got a truth that is not going to be changing, and so we're not going to try to conform truth to the culture. We're going to let the Bible set the standard.
Well, and this is what Machen had to say during his inaugural address at Westminster Theological Seminary on September 25th, 1929. He said this. He said, quote, "We believe first that the Christian religion, as set forth in the Confession of Faith of the Presbyterian Church, is true. We believe second that the Christian religion welcomes and is capable of scholarly defense. And we believe, third, that the Christian religion should be proclaimed without fear or favor, and in clear opposition to whatever opposes it, whether from within or without the church, as the only way of salvation for lost mankind. On that platform, brethren, we stand. Pray that we may be enabled by God's grace to stand firm. Pray that the students who go forth from Westminster Theological Seminary may know Christ as their own Savior and may proclaim to others the gospel of his love." So he makes clear that this is why we exist. This is the whole reason we're developing and we're founding this seminary. And really, there's no way around it. We believe what the confession says. We believe that the Christian faith is an intellectual faith that engages not only the heart but also the head.
Yes.
And that we also,
Yes.
believe that the Christian faith should be proclaimed without fear. That we should not be afraid of what the culture does to us. And I think Machen embodied this in particular in his fight with Princeton and in his fight with, the PCUSA at large.
And and for what it's worth, he did die young, but
Yes.
for the rest of his life, which after he, formed Westminster Theological Seminary and founded the OPC and everything like that, he didn't have much longer after that. And he didn't know it, he wasn't aware. It's not that he had a slow fade or anything like that, or, it came on quick. He died of pneumonia, but for the rest of his life, he championed that cause. He was maybe not the loudest voice. He was maybe not the most famous voice, but man, he was a champion for that cause.
Yeah.
And he fought hard, tooth and nail. So much so that he was defrocked.
Yes. So he left Princeton in 1929, but he didn't leave the PCUSA or the Northern Presbyterian Church. He stayed in for another 6 or 7 years.
Again, I think calling in there that, like he said, there might be a time when we have to step aside and we have to get out. And so he got out of the school or the academic arena of it and said, let's make sure we have academia that is going to be biblically based.
Right.
But he didn't leave the church.
No.
He still stayed within the church because he still saw that as a primary fight that he needed to take up and champion and be a voice in.
And this all, this all came to a head in 1932. So the Presbyterian Board of Foreign Missions was kind of, they were kind of lax in some of the liberal theology that was, permeating, a lot of the mission field.
Which he says in the
Presbyterian Church, yeah. And so he formed what was known as the Independent Board of Presbyterian Foreign Missions. And really, this was sort of his way of remaining within the denomination and trying to combat this liberal sort of ideology that was taking place on the mission field. Because the only thing worse than entertaining sort of heretical doctrines, liberal theology and all these sorts of things within your own church or your own denomination is to export it around the world. And so he thought this is, okay, as of right now, right, this is kind of an in-house fight. This is something we're working out as a denomination. But then it got worse, and it was like, oh, so we're not having an in-house fight anymore. We're now sending this garbage elsewhere.
We are propagating.
Yes.
We are, this out there in a mission field
in the name of our denomination, in the name of the Christian faith. And we see that. We see that sort of thing today with some of the health and wealth prosperity gospel.
It is
in the name of American
one.
Christianity. If you were to classify it that way, the main export of American Christianity is prosperity theology and the health and wealth gospel.
It's the number one religion, and I say that loosely. Well, no, it is a religion. I don't say it loosely. It is a religion. It's a false religion. It is a cult-ish religion, but it is a religion that is not Christian, and it is being exported more than any other religion from America.
Right. And so So that happened in 1932. In 1934, the General Assembly of the PCUSA actually censured him for doing this, and eventually they came around in 1935 and they defrocked him. They basically took away his credentials. So we're Baptists, and as of right now we're in cooperation with the Southern Baptist Convention. But in order to be a minister in a Baptist church, right, you have to be ordained, and it's the same in just about any church, really. And in particular, in Presbyterian churches, their ordination process is pretty rigorous.
A lot more than Baptist.
Yeah, a lot more than Baptist. And I have a friend. He's in the PCA, and he is working on, eventually becoming an ordained elder in the PCA, and he's kind of at really the start of this journey. And some of the things he was telling me he's got to go through, is, like I said, it's rigorous. But in 1935, they basically took his credentials away. And so he went through the work. He went through the process of becoming an ordained minister in this denomination, and because of his commitment to biblical truth, they took that ordination away.
Yeah, man.
They said you're no longer allowed to serve.
They said, we're going to take it back. You're no longer recognized as any kind of authority, any kind of minister, any kind of teacher, any kind of anything here in our denomination. And I guess denomination wouldn't have been the appropriate term. Well, it probably was the appropriate term back then.
Yeah, I would think so.
But they said you can't be a part of that. You absolutely cannot be. So I love Machen's move here.
Yeah.
You're going to defrock me? You know what we're going to do? We're founding something else, buddy.
That's right. And so it was after being defrocked that he went on to form the Orthodox Presbyterian Church,
the OPC.
Which again has a strong reputation of being committed to the Reformed faith and to the conservative understanding of the Reformed faith. And really, when we look at Machen's life, we can read his books, we can read his biographies, we can read his letters, but his legacy comes, or we really see the true testament to his legacy in Westminster Theological Seminary and in the Orthodox Presbyterian Church. Those are the two big institutions that really are continuing Machen's legacy and his fight against all things that stand opposed to the Christian faith.
Which is, and it is something to say that, he started between 1935 and 1936 founding the OPC. And then in 1937, man, he dies on New Year's Day. Yeah. 1937, he dies of pneumonia. And man, he didn't see that coming. No. Nobody did.
He actually went to North Dakota to make good on some commitments he had made for speaking engagements. Mm-hmm. And it was while he was in North Dakota that he caught pneumonia and died on January 1st, 1937.
And so, we see this
at a very young age of 55.
Yeah. And so we see this guy who was, man, in a lot of ways, he was such a bulldog, and just would not be, he would not leave. Right. Unless he absolutely felt convicted that he had to go.
Or until they kicked him out. And that's such a difference. And that's why I called him a bulldog. It's such a difference from today's time. A lot of times we get the mindset, especially here in America, and understand, again, Machen is an American. Yeah.
We get the mindset here in America that, well, if I don't like what the preacher is saying, or if I don't like this, that, or the other at this church, I will go across the street and I'll find one that's more to my liking.
Find a new church, a new job, a new group of friends, new girlfriend, a new wife, new whatever.
We're
new
all
family.
About that. But a lot of the stories of these great men of faith are the ones who sat there and said, no, I see the problem, I acknowledge the problem, and I don't abandon. Rather, I roll up my sleeves and I go to work.
Right,
and I will work until either I am convinced by Scripture that I have to wipe the dust from my feet, as Paul would have done. I am kicked out for the sake of the gospel, or I am called home to be with the Lord.
Right.
Which is where that's why Machen left all the things that he was convicted by Scripture. It was time to wipe the dust from his feet from Princeton. So he did. And what did he do? He goes and forms a Westminster Theological Seminary so that he can continue doing the work, but just in a better situation. He would not leave the PCUSA. They kicked him out. They turned their back on him.
Right.
And then he worked until he died to ensure that the gospel was continued on. And gone is that mindset. But man, if there has ever been a time that Christians need to return to that understanding and that passion and kind of that bulldog mentality, man, we need it today.
Oh, absolutely. And I think, more than anything else, this is, this to me is my biggest takeaway from Machen, is that he was primarily committed to being faithful to God and His Word wherever he was.
Yes.
He wasn't chasing a movement. He wasn't chasing his own fame and fortune. He wasn't trying, like I mentioned earlier, he wasn't trying to hack the algorithms so that he could, go viral in a manner of speaking. He was just committed to being faithful where God had him.
Yes.
And I think that's what we need more than anything today. Is we need men and women to be faithful in the areas God has called them. We need fathers and mothers to be faithful in their families where God has placed them. We need pastors to be faithful to their churches. And I mean, just speaking of pastors, it seems like every pastor today wants to be a celebrity pastor.
Yeah.
And every pastor today wants, is chasing the likes and is chasing, the views and all these sorts of things. And, all the while their congregation is not being fed. It's not being ministered to.
But boy, they got a lot of views that day.
Right. And, how many, and we said this about Spurgeon, how many pastors throughout the history of the church have faithfully served their congregations? How many fathers have faithfully served their wives and their families that we don't know about simply because they're not the video that went viral. Or they're not the one that blew up or whatever. And so I think that rather than sort of chasing these highs, our primary concern needs to just be where has God put me? How can I be faithful here?
Day in and day out.
Right.
And how do I remain faithful until either I'm convinced I wipe the dust from my feet, the world or the institution turns its back on me, or the Lord calls me home.
Yeah. Absolutely.
I'll go and I do the work, and there's no changing that. And so, when you look at Machen's life, man, he was so much a breath of fresh air, especially with what we see today. People just abandon and they leave and they go and they forget and they just change. They change occupations, or they change ministries, or they change this, that, and the other about their life.
Or they change their convictions because, I want to lose my friends. I don't want to lose my job.
Yeah, almost as quickly as they change a shirt, man.
Yeah.
And so when we look at that, so what was it that drove him? And this book really does lay it out pretty well. What is it that drove him to fight? What was the things he saw in liberalism that he said, hey, no, we've got to fight these things? And he kind of breaks it down to 6 things. The 6 chapters are how he breaks it down. So he says, hey, we've got to fight for doctrine. We've got to fight for the biblical understanding of God and man.
Yeah.
We've got to fight for the Bible and how the Bible describes itself and how we understand the Bible is throughout all of time. We've got to fight for Christ. We've got to fight for salvation. And we've got to fight for the church.
Right.
And he did that day in and day out.
Well, and it's always interesting that throughout church history, clarity on biblical teaching always arises out of controversy. And I think what Machen does a really good job of in Christianity and liberalism is highlighting what some of the fundamentals of the Christian faith are.
Yes.
We always say major on the majors, minor on the minors. These are primary issues, these are secondary issues. And so I think he does a good job of highlighting these, in these 6 chapters. Like you said, these are primary issues.
Yes.
And it's because liberalism differs on these primary issues that it's categorized as a separate religion.
Yeah.
And he wrote a short little biography called Christianity in Conflict. And he just kind of, briefly kind of touches on some of the big events in his life. I mean, it's very short. But he talks about sort of why he wrote Christianity and Liberalism. And here's what he says. He says, in my little book, Christianity and Liberalism, I tried to show that the issue in the church of the present day is not between 2 varieties of the same religion, but at bottom between 2 essentially different types of thought and life. There is much interlocking of the branches, but the 2 tendencies, modernism and supernaturalism, or otherwise designated non-doctrinal religion and historic Christianity, spring from different roots. In particular, I tried to show that Christianity is not a, quote, life as distinguished from a doctrine, and not a life that has doctrine as its changing symbolic expression, but that, exactly the other way around, it is a life founded on a doctrine.
Right. That Christianity, you cannot, and so and he addresses this in the book, and it still prevails today, this mindset that, man, I just love Jesus, man. I just love Jesus, man. Or God loves you, man. And don't get weighed down into the nitty gritty of I don't need doctrine. I just need Jesus and that kind of stuff. We get
right.
We
No
still
doctrine
hear those,
but the Bible, no creed but Christ.
And that's right. We hear those
which
kinds
is itself
of things.
a doctrine and a creed.
That's right. We hear those sorts of things today, and it was ignorant then, and it's ignorant today.
Yes.
But it's got, like all heresies, it's got a nagging way of sticking around and getting popularized.
Yes.
And that's why it's so important, again, to see that the heresies never get tired, and the heretics never get tired of their heresies. But so often we find that truth is not tired of being truth. Truth is never worn down. But those who communicate truth, man, we do get tired of communicating the gospel. We try and find different or new ways of saying those things. No, like Machen said, we have got to be devoted to the majors. We major on the majors, minor on the minors. We've got to be devoted to those things and never grow tired of saying those truths.
Well, like Jude
day
says,
in and day out.
Like Jude says, we contend for the faith once for all delivered to the saints. We're not trying to invent anything new.
Right.
We're not trying to find a new phenomenon. It's a historic faith that's rooted in historical events, and it's that we're proclaiming. It's nothing else.
Right. And those truths were true when they were first said. They're true today, and they can still and will still go against every heretical view. They will win over every heretical view, and they are worth fighting over every heretical view. And those heretics will never get tired of espousing their lies. We must never grow weary and tired of sharing the truth of the gospel of Christ. And Machen said it. He said it in the introduction, sets it up throughout the rest of the course of the books. We've got the doctrines. We've got God and man, Scripture, Christ, salvation, and the church. Never waver on how the Bible identifies those things.
Right. And in the introduction, he asks this question. He says, what is the relationship between Christianity and modern culture? May Christianity be maintained in a scientific age? And he goes on to say, it is this problem which modern liberalism attempts to solve. Mm-hmm. And so modern liberalism is trying to bridge the gap or mesh this sort of enlightenment, sort of scientific understanding of the world and the historic Christian faith. And what always ends up happening is that when you have competing ideologies, when you have contrary religions, what always ends up happening is one wins out.
Yeah.
They can never be maintained together. One always wins out. And unfortunately, what we see constantly in our day is that it is always that which is contrary to Christianity that wins out. And so you have this sort of, like I said, this modern, quote, scientific understanding of the world, really Darwinistic understanding of the world. And we're trying to blend it with Christianity, and it's not possible. As Machen points out, there's some interlocking of the branches, between these ideologies, but they are coming from different roots. They are two separate trees. And we can't, there's no way for these to be grafted in together.
And that's important to understand. One of the things that we are, I do believe this, I believe that we are called as Christians to be culturally relevant, but it's in this way. If I'm going to be on the mission field in Spain, well, I better understand how to speak Spanish. Those kinds of things. That is a cultural relevance that is absolutely applicable. What I never am called to do is to let cultural relevance or the ideas of the culture permeate Christianity.
Yes.
And that's what we see so many times. And Machen says, yes, if we can put it in kind of common vernacular today, there is a cultural relevance that is important with Christianity. Absolutely, there is a cultural relevance that we should understand and that we should work with. Absolutely. But that cultural relevance is a different root. It's a different tree. And even though there are times when they meet, and even though there are times where maybe they even intertwine, they are never to be seen as primary. That cultural relevance is never primary over and above the gospel.
Right.
And so that's where liberalism, as he addresses in this book, that's where liberalism has gone astray. They've taken cultural relevance, and it's not just a language thing, cultural relevance in terms of the ideas of the culture were permeating Christianity, and that was becoming a more important over and above the gospel way of thinking that was permeating the church, the academics, and Machen was saying, no. It cannot take precedence over the gospel of Christ.
Right. And that's really the drive of the book. He says this in the introduction. He says, modern liberalism may be criticized, one, on the ground that it is unchristian. And that's ultimately where his beef comes from. It isn't that, well, I just don't like this idea. It's that fundamentally, like he said, it springs from a different root. Right. And it's not a Christian root. And he also goes on to say the second criticism is on the ground that it's unscientific. And I think he's absolutely correct. That
he is right.
In defense of sort of these Darwinistic, atheistic, naturalistic positions, science has deviated from science.
Yeah.
They've deviated from true science.
Yeah.
And we see that kind of on display today, where any disagreement with the scientific consensus is censored. They don't want to engage the issue. They want to be right.
That's right. And the thing is the scientific method, and I've said this before, the scientific method is always to follow the evidence back to its logical conclusion and everything like that. Well, atheism already puts its cards on the table, and it says, we'll follow the evidence to its logical conclusion unless that logical conclusion is God. Atheism means not God. We will say we will follow it to everything except God, not God.
Well, and when you start with, and this is the reality, we all, approach the evidence with certain presuppositions. Mm-hmm. We have a lens and a framework through which we interpret the evidence. Because we are Bible-believing Christians, we look at the evidence and say, this evidence needs to be interpreted. It needs to be filtered through the lens of Scripture. Mm-hmm. And that's where we come to understand the evidence. Well, modern man and modern science likes to pretend that it's playing on neutral ground. Yeah. That, okay, you can have your fundamental pre-commitments, but over here in the scientific realm, in the modern realm, we are playing on neutral ground, and we just want to follow the evidence where it leads. We're just examining the brute facts. Well, philosopher Cornelius Van Til, who left Princeton to go with Machen to Westminster, has said there's no such thing as brute facts. There's no such thing as true neutrality.
Right.
That even the atheist has fundamental presuppositions and pre-commitments through which he's filtering the evidence. And one of them, like you said, is they're fundamentally pre-committed to this idea that there's no God, that there cannot be a supernatural explanation for what we see around us.
So much so that they will avoid anything that looks like
they start with naturalism, and they follow the evidence, and they reason back to naturalism, and they go, look at this. The evidence needs to naturalism. And it's like, well, that's because that's where you started. Yeah. And this is really what it comes down to, is we have to examine those presuppositions and say, okay, which is actually consistent with reality, right? And ultimately, if atheism is true, well, then why do we care about science?
Why do we care about anything?
Exactly. There's no reason to. And so you're caring about something, you're caring about evidence, is actually contrary to your fundamental and foundational presupposition, which is naturalism. You can't have both.
And it's interesting how, Machen made that statement, in this book, and he was an academic. He was an intellectual. He was someone who was able to fight in that arena, and because he said it, it held weight. Today, we don't get the same kind of a glance because the whole not God, it can be anything except for God mindset is so permeated into the quote-unquote scientific community that we don't get that same, respect or grace there that, well, intellectuals do believe these things. But does that mean we still, because they don't recognize, they don't give us the grace or the respect that maybe Machen received, does that mean we stop taking up those fights? The answer is no. Because truth is still truth.
Right.
And we must never grow tired of proclaiming the truth.
Well, and it's the gospel of Jesus Christ that is the power unto salvation.
That's right.
And, Scripture tells us that the natural man cannot discern the things of God because they're spiritually discerned.
That's right.
And so we recognize that going in. Well, of course you don't accept these things because you're still dead in your trespasses and sins.
That's right.
And in order for you to come to not only accept the truth, but to love the truth, it's through regeneration. It's through God taking your heart of stone and giving you a heart of flesh. It's only then that you can come to see reality for what it truly is.
That's right.
Again, going back to Van Til, defined sort of reason and rationalism as thinking God's thoughts after him.
Mm-hmm.
That again, like we mentioned, there's no brute facts. All facts are God's facts.
Yeah.
And reality is God's reality. And so in order for us to be reasonable or rational or logical, we have to think God's thoughts after him.
Yeah.
And the reality is that sinful man can't think God's thoughts after him because he's dead in his trespasses and sins. His reason is faulty. And so we don't look at that and say, well, because of that, I'm gonna stay out of this fight. I'm not gonna engage. No, we go in and we say, no. Your understanding, your reasoning is faulty, and it's contrary to reality.
Yeah.
But the reason is because you don't have the gospel.
Right.
Well, so let me go ahead and tear down your presuppositions. Let me tear down your understanding, this false understanding of reality. But let me also give you the gospel.
Yeah.
So that you can come to know the truth.
So that you can start thinking rightly about these things.
Truth. Absolutely.
Yeah. So that you can start understanding these things, so that your eyes can be open to the revealed truth that God has given us.
Yeah. Yeah. And so at the end of, this introduction where, he's really laying out, this is why I'm writing this book. He says this, in the midst of all the material achievements of modern life, one may well ask the question whether in gaining the whole world, we have not lost our own soul. Mm-hmm. Are we forever condemned to live the sordid life of utilitarianism? Or is there some lost secret which, if discovered, will restore to mankind something of the glories of the past? Such a secret, the writer of this little book would discover in the Christian religion. But the Christian religion, which is meant, is certainly not the religion of the modern liberal church, but a message of divine grace, almost forgotten, as it was in the Middle Ages, but destined to burst forth once more in God's good time in a new reformation and bring light and freedom to mankind. And that was needed in Machen's day.
Yeah.
And I think more than ever, that's needed in our day as well.
Absolutely it is. Absolutely is. And let us all be willing to take up that call and be bulldogs and contend for the truth.
We hope that you enjoyed this discussion of Christianity and liberalism, and we hope that it has been edifying to you and your walk with Christ. Now, this conversation is by no means exhaustive, so we pray that our discussion leads to meaningful conversations with friends and family as you learn what it means to contend for the faith, once for all delivered to the saints. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to contact us at podcasts@northclay.org. For more information from North Clay Baptist Church or from the Ardent Archives, visit our website at www.northclay.org. We look forward to learning with you again soon, here on the Ardent Archives.